Hi guys. Great, great to follow Per. Great act to follow, difficult act to follow, I think, but I'll do my best. We're going to change. Change the tone a little bit. I think what I'm going to be talking about is going to be far less technical than what you've been hearing so far in this room this afternoon. I'm JC Gaillard. I'm the managing director and founder of Corex Partners. I'm a management consultant. I run a management consultancy firm based in London, focusing on cybersecurity strategy, organization, and governance. I also animate the Security Transformation Research Foundation, and that's a think tank associated to Corex Partners, which is aimed at exploring how the narrative needs to change around cybersecurity for the industry, for society at large to move forward. And the piece of research I'm going to be talking to you about this afternoon is a piece of research we developed during the summer under the label of the Security Transformation Research Foundation. And essentially, we're going to be looking back at the way the language of security has changed over the last 2 decades. We're going to try to put those things a little bit into perspective. You know, how have we changed the way we talk about security, us, security professionals, security practitioners, you know, looking back across the last 2 decades. And that's the sort of journey I'm going to try to take you through in a quantitative manner, because essentially what we've done is that we've analyzed the semantic content, the language content of 17 global information security surveys from EY. You know, those surveys you guys might be familiar with. You know, every firm, every Big Four firm put one of those out every year. And we've analyzed the language content, the semantics content of 17 of those from EY. So we're going to be talking about the language of security a little bit in a quantitative manner, out of our findings from that semantic analysis. I want to take you through a few points of methodology first, and to put things a little bit into context as well. Why did we do this to start with? Well, our prime objective, of course, was to try to analyze in a quantitative way the way our focus and our priorities as a security industry have changed across the last 2 decades. But to be honest, the hypothesis I was testing myself, based on my own 20 years of experience in that space, is really the hypothesis of industry stagnation. The fact that we all come to those lovely conferences, but we end up talking about the same things all the time, and that all this goes round and round and round in circle quite seriously. That's not what I found, and that's why I'm here to talk to you, essentially. Why did we use the EY reports? Well, fundamentally, the length of time they cover was the main factor. I mean, they were first published in 1998. EY are very proud of that, of those 20 years of association with the cybersecurity industry or the information security industry, that, you know, in that way across such a long period of time. Frankly, we also have to praise the consistency of their format and the quality of the research, the quality of the writing, and all those factors really are the main reason why we decided to work on the basis of those reports. PwC have been doing it as well, but they started considerably later. Deloitte and KPMG tend to have a different approach, maybe more industry focused. So the EY reports were good for us, and that's essentially what we used. EY are aware of this. I mean, there is no secret here. If any of you is in relation with them, or, you know, there is no secret at all. I mean, they know of this survey. They're supportive. They're interested, and frankly, there is nothing bad to say about them anyway. So that's the point about EY and why did we use them. And you know, how did we proceed and why did we decide to analyze the language and not the results? Because of course in those reports, if you're familiar with those, you've got the actual results, the questions, the pie charts, the graphs, and then you've got the commentary. Of course, not having access to the underlying data sets made it difficult to compare like with like when it came to analyze to the analysis of the results themselves. Even if the same question was asked in 2005 and in 2012, not knowing, you know, who actually answered that question, it was very difficult to normalize the result and to compare like with like. So we focused on the commentary, the language, the wording of those reports, which of course is in regards to the pie charts and the graphs. So of course the language reflects the results in the diagram.
diagrams, and of course the diagrams and the results reflect what the people being interviewed have told the consultants. So all in all, there is a degree of consistency here, which gives us confidence that, by analyzing the language, we're actually reflecting the focus and the priorities of the industry at any given moment. So that's essentially what we did. We scraped all the words from all those reports. We put them into a bag of words. We removed all the stop words. We removed all the acronyms. We removed all the noise, really, and we ended up with approximately 80,000 words to search from. And I insist, there is nothing fancy here. There is nothing which goes beyond the complexity of a percentage calculation. There is no AI involved here. It's just we've been counting words essentially, and we're going to be talking about the frequency of words in a report. Again, it's the mathematical complexity of a percentage. Even the word semantics. I mean, if there are semantics experts here, I don't know, but I mean, some friends of mine who are a bit more experts in that field have told me, you haven't really done anything in terms of semantics here. You've been counting words, and I say, yeah, all right, maybe I shouldn't be talking too much about the semantics analysis and more language analysis. But I mean, you're going to see what I'm talking about when I start getting into the results. So 5 findings, essentially, which I'm bringing to you as an indication, really, of the way the language of security has evolved. If you've been involved in the industry for 20 years, you may recognize some patterns you've been involved with. If you haven't, you may recognize things which you like as well, and which certainly will give you some context and will show you that there is indeed an historical continuum here, which is worth knowing, I suspect. For example, cyber and cybersecurity. Well, the word cyber and the word cybersecurity appear in the top 100 of our word counts in 2013. Okay? Just as a piece of an interesting nugget of information, We haven't been talking about cybersecurity all our life. What were we talking about before? Well, we were talking about information security, of course. Anyway, let's get into the results proper. The first finding is essentially that, when you look at those words and you look at the top of the list, I mean, that's where I started. I looked at the top of the list, at the more common words, the words which come up the more often across all reports. And what do you find? Well, you find, of course, all the usual suspects: security, information, organization, management, business. Okay. So the first impression is, oh my God, I mean, this is going to be, management jargon all the way. It's going to be generic jargon all the way. That's the way. Is that the way we really talk about security when we try to take a step back? Because that's a little bit what those reports are meant to be. They're meant to be elevating the debate a little bit, and they're meant to be talking to senior execs or addressing senior execs. Well, yes, of course, the most common words are generic. But when you start looking at the proportion of those words, in each report, you see a trend emerging, which is the fact that the proportion of those most common words is diminishing. So I think there is room to push as the first finding the fact that somehow there is a trend there in our research which shows that we tend to speak about security in a more and more specific language. The proportion of those generic terms seems to be diminishing. That's the first finding I think I'm putting forward. And that's really the first finding I came across, and that's the point from which we started digging, okay, into the data a little bit more. Because the next question, of course, is if we are talking about security in a more and more specific manner, in what way are we becoming more specific? And when you start looking at the words in the list, below the top 5 or the top 10, you start to realize, and now we're getting a little bit more into the field of semantics properly, you start to realize, of course, that words carry different meaning, okay? And you start to see that there is indeed a bias analysis which can be made here. Some words convey, for example, a more positive or a more negative bias. Some words convey a more technical or more managerial bias. And we've actually analyzed the bias in the reports according to those 2 dimensions, from technical to managerial, from positive to negative. For example, words like results, success carry a positive bias. Words like threat, attack, incident carry a negative bias. Words like leaders, leadership carry more managerial bias. Words like malware, ransomware, virus, cloud carry a more technical bias. So we've analyzed the bias in those reports across those two dimensions, and we found a very interesting shift, as a matter of fact. We found 2 decades clearly separated by what appeared to be a clear semantic shift. When you look at the reports from 2002 and 2009, they very clearly have a more positive and a more managerial bias compared to the reports we've seen since. So, based on that, the second finding here we're putting forward is that if we talk about security in a more and more specific manner, we also talk about security in a more and more negative and in a more and more technical manner as well. And that's very much the second finding here, together with that very interesting demarcation line in 2010. Okay? And that's really the piece we explored next. What does this demarcation line tell us in 2010? What really has changed across those 2 decades? And digging a little bit more about the way a number of keyword markers evolve, we saw really a significant shift in focus across the 2 decades. I mean, if you look at keyword markers like risk, compliance, like compliance, regulatory regulation, you see a clear downward trend. They dominate the first decade and they subside during the next. In parallel, if you look at keyword markers like incident, threats, what else have we got? Breaches, intrusion. You see the opposite trend. Okay, they clearly become more and more prominent during the second decade, the decade we're in, the decade which is coming to an end. And similarly, if you look at the way the word risk is used against the word threat, you see that the word risk is used in a far more prominent manner during the first decade, and that gradually the word threat becomes more and more prominent, and at the moment we are probably using them in an interchangeable manner. So I think we do see a significant shift in focus across the 2 decades, and the impression here is that the compliance and risk considerations which dominate the first decade clearly are replaced by considerations of incidents and threats during the following decade. There is an additional piece of analysis here which I need to bring up, which is our fourth finding, which is, again, digging into what happened around that junction between the 2 decades, looking at what happened around 2010, what do we see? We see an enormous burst of interest, an enormous burst of language around cloud and outsourcing. That's not a big surprise for any of you if you've been involved around, in the industry at the time. But we see that burst dominating the period 2010, 2011, 2012, and the fantastic thing is that it vanishes into acceptance, it vanishes into normality almost after that. But really what dominates here is that, frankly, it's the sense that the last decade, the decade we're in, the one which is coming to an end, is really dominated by that sense of realization. The sense that this is no longer just about compliance or risk. I mean, ultimately, risk is about things which may or may not happen. Compliance is about putting ticks in boxes. We all know that. No, there is a different sense here. The sense that tech is changing, the sense that this is real, the sense that incidents do happen, the sense that they harm business, they impact business. So you really have that sense of realization, really, which dominates the decade we're in. And finally, continuing to dig into the language we're using and looking back at the residual business language we used. At the beginning of all this, I said, we tend to talk about security in a more and more technical, more and more specific language, but more and more technical and more negative. When we look at the residual business language, we do see a trend towards a more specific and a sharper language as well. Markers like digital innovation, growth, value, clearly become more and more prominent. But the thing which is really concerning from my perspective, and probably the most interesting finding for me, is the piece at the bottom here. The fact that throughout the 2 decades, markers, keyword markers indicating or related to the language of execution clearly dwindle. They're clearly on the way down. Words like objectives, delivery, results, priorities, all the language which is genuinely the language of execution, that's clearly diminishing in proportion in those reports, and to a lesser extent, but I think it also makes sense here, all the language related to people, culture, and skills. That's also clearly diminishing in proportion in the reports, and you're left with a situation where, frankly, keywords markers such as risk, threat, compliance, incidents are effectively 3.5 times more frequent across all reports than keyword markers like governance, budget, delivery, priority, culture, or skills. So you're left with the impression that, frankly, the industry is very good at talking about what could go wrong, but not so good at talking about what we could do to fix it. Okay, and that's a little bit the bottom line here for me at the end of this. So just to reach the final part of the talk here, what is all this showing us? It's showing us 2 decades. Up to 2009, what I'm calling here the compliance decade. A period during which security is fundamentally a balancing act between compliance requirements, risk appetite, and costs. The CISO as a risk manager, I'm using as a cliche here. 2010 to today, really, a decade I'm calling the realization decade. That's what I was saying before. The sense that security is a necessary barrier against real threats, that this is real, that it's really happening, that it does harm business, that it's not just about compliance and risk. Okay. And all that, of course, in the context of massive technological change, in the context of the aftermath of a financial crisis of historical proportions, and of course in the context of very significant digital transformation and digital disruption for many industries. Okay, and to use a cliche, I'm saying the CISO as firefighter here. That's a little bit what I'm seeing. CISOs not being able to get out of firefighting mode because there is always something going on. There is always some fires to put off. Where does that take us? What could we say? What do you want the next decade to be? What do we want the next decade to be? Well, what I'm putting to you is that the industry needs to pivot towards an execution paradigm. Going back to what I said around our finding 5, our execution language has not been prominent enough. We need to focus more on delivering, on executing, on getting things done. Okay, and that's really what I'm calling the execution decade. Security is no longer just about putting ticks in boxes. It's no longer just about risk. It's not a necessary evil. It's a business imperative. It's a business imperative in the when not if era, in an era where you have to assume you're going to be breached, and senior executives are assuming their business is going to be breached. And of course, in a context where if you're waking up today, at the back end of 20 years of lip service, underinvestment, or adverse prioritization by your business, you may have a very significant challenge. You may have a very significant challenge if your maturity is low, and of course, regulators and politicians have stepped in, and now all this is happening under the threat of pretty considerable fines, which are business impacting under GDPR and a variety of regulations we can see emerging around the world. So the CISO's transformation leader is really the cliche I'm using to encompass what the next decade could be or should be about. And I leave you with 3 management considerations around that. Going back a little bit to the profile of the CISO and to what challenges organizations are facing here if they are genuinely waking up to a pretty significant transformation challenge. Well, the first point is that the profile of the transformation leader is key here. A good firefighter is not a good transformer, as I'm saying on the slide, and many CISOs are struggling, to be honest, in my experience around around large-scale transformation challenges. There is a bit of a lost decade here for CISOs as well. I mean, when you are constantly dragged into firefighting, when you're constantly dealing with technical problems, you don't develop the managerial or the leadership skills you need to drive a 7 or an 8-digit transformation program of work. So there are a number of very significant considerations around the profile of transformation leaders here for organizations which are facing that type of challenge. And my second point is that, of course, transformation on a large scale takes time. And there may not be quick wins. Security is a complex beast. It cuts across corporate silos. Large organizations work in silos. That's the only thing they know. And security cuts across. So security transformation is a very hard challenge, and it takes the time it takes to cut it short. And that's a challenge more for senior management, because senior management must be able to look beyond short-termism and to stay focused on the right term to drive the right transformational objectives around security. And I don't know if any of you have heard me talk on this topic here or elsewhere, but this is often a very, very hard challenge for many organizations. And at this stage, that's the point where I normally say, you cannot take security out of the broader corporate context of any organization. You cannot take security governance out of the governance of any organizations. And there are organizations which are well managed. There are organizations which are not so well managed. There are organizations which there are industries which are doing well, industries which are not doing so well. And that's what it is. But here, going back to transformation around large-scale transformation program, being able to remain focused on the right mid to long-term objective is key, and it's often a very complex challenge for organizations. And my final point, it's worth saying it, again and again, more than ever, for organizations facing large-scale transformation programs, this is about culture and governance. This is about culture and governance more than technology. It's about culture and governance before technology. Throwing money at tech vendors, is just looking for quick wins which don't exist, or for a magic bullet which doesn't exist. That has never built anything lasting. You need to think about the right organization, the right operating model, as well as technology, and to more than ever, it's about people, process, then technology, and very much in that order if you're facing a large-scale transformation program. That's it from me. Have I done well in terms of time? No, I'm ahead.
Yep. Thank you.
Any